ruthlessly evicted into the freezing rain.
Mommy, I'm
A desperate
scared.
mother
It's
and
okay,
her
we'll be
5-year-old
safe.
daughter were tossed onto the street by her millionaire parents with just $14. The arrogant couple gleefully believed they had ruined her life forever. They had no idea the rotting, abandoned shack she inherited secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune. And they never suspected it concealed the exact weapon she needed to obliterate their empire and use an $85 million legacy to buy back the very mansion they kicked her out of. Alice Jefferson stood on the meticulously manicured lawn of her childhood home in Greenwich, Connecticut, the biting November wind tearing right through her thin denim jacket. Beside her, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one missing eye, was her 5-year-old daughter, Lily. They were shivering, not just from the plummeting temperature, but from the sheer icy shock of what was unfolding in front of them. On the porch stood Richard and Barbara Jefferson, Alice's parents. Richard, a retired investment banker with a permanent scowl etched into his features, was watching a locksmith drill out the deadbolt of the guest house Alice had been living in for the past 6 months. Barbara, dressed in a pristine cashmere sweater, refused to even make eye contact, choosing instead to intensely inspect her manicured nails. "Dad, please," Alice begged, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of freezing rain washed over her. "You can't do this. I have Lily. Just give me 1 more week. My next paycheck from the diner clears on Friday. I'll have enough for a motel." Richard didn't even blink. He adjusted his expensive silk scarf and looked at his daughter with a gaze devoid of any paternal warmth. "We gave you 6 months, Alice. 6 months to get your life together after that deadbeat David Miller walked out on you. Instead, you're pouring coffee for minimum wage and embarrassing this family. We are selling the estate. The buyers want the guest house empty by tomorrow." "But it's 20-degree outside," Alice screamed, her panic rising as Lily began to cry, burying her small face into Alice's leg. "Where are we supposed to go?" "That is exactly the kind of problem a 26-year-old woman should be able to solve," Richard replied coldly. "You chose to drop out of nursing school. You chose to keep a child you couldn't afford. It is time you face the consequences of the real world. Now get off my property before I call the police for trespassing." The sheer brutality of those words struck Alice like a physical blow. Her own father, her own mother, who simply turned her back and walked inside the warmth of their multi-million-dollar mansion without a single word of goodbye to her only granddaughter. Alice scooped up the sobbing Lily, threw their 2 trash bags full of clothes into the trunk of her beat-up 2008 Honda Civic, and drove away. That night was the lowest point of Alice's life. She parked under the glaring, flickering lights of a Walmart parking lot. She layered every piece of clothing she owned over Lily, holding the little girl against her chest to share body heat. The engine was off to save the quarter tank of gas she had left. As Alice stared up at the frost forming on the inside of the windshield, she silently promised her daughter that she would find a way out of this hell. She didn't know how, but she would. Morning broke with a cruel gray light. Alice checked her phone to see the battery at a critical 6%. She had one notification, a voicemail from an unknown number. Assuming it was another aggressive debt collector chasing down the medical bills from Lily's asthma treatments, Alice almost deleted it. But something made her press the speaker icon. "Miss Jefferson, this is Samuel Higgins, attorney at law. I am trying to reach you regarding the estate of your great-uncle Arthur Pendleton. Please call my office immediately. It is a matter of utmost urgency." Alice froze. Great-uncle Arthur. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade. Arthur was her grandfather's brother, the legendary black sheep of the Jefferson family. According to family lore, Arthur was an eccentric, paranoid veteran who despised banks, hated the government, and had completely alienated himself from the rest of the wealthy Jefferson clan. He lived out his days as a hermit in a remote part of upstate New York. With shaking hands, Alice dialed the number. An hour later, Alice sat in the plush mahogany-paneled office of Samuel Higgins. The lawyer, a kind-eyed man in his late 60s, poured her a hot cup of tea and offered Lily a plate of butter cookies. "I'm sorry for your loss, Alice," Samuel said, gently folding his hands on his desk. "Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks ago. I barely knew him," Alice admitted, wrapping her freezing hands around the warm mug. "Why are you contacting me? Shouldn't my father be handling this?" Samuel let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Arthur explicitly barred your father from receiving a single dime. In fact, Arthur's will was quite brief. He left his vintage 1968 Mustang to your Aunt Beatrice, purely because she once complimented it in 1994. Everything else, his land and his primary residence, has been left entirely to you." Alice's heart stopped. A residence? A house? It didn't matter if it was a cabin or a trailer. It was a roof. It was shelter. A house. "He left me a house." "A property in the dense woods of Oak Haven, New York," Samuel corrected, pulling out a thick manila folder and sliding a tarnished brass key across the desk. "I must warn you, Alice. Arthur was a unique man. The property has not been maintained in any traditional sense. The taxes are fully paid for the next 10 years, a quirk of his extreme paranoia about losing the land, but the structure itself is severely dilapidated." Alice stared at the brass key as if it were glowing. She didn't care if the roof leaked. She didn't care if it was in the middle of nowhere. It was hers. A place where nobody could ever kick her out again. "I'll take it," Alice said firmly, slipping the key into her pocket. The drive to Oak Haven took nearly 5 hours. As Alice's tired Honda labored up the winding, muddy mountain roads, the dense canopy of pine trees blocked out the afternoon sun, casting the world in a perpetual eerie twilight. Cell service vanished entirely. When the GPS finally announced they had arrived, Alice hit the brakes, staring through the windshield in absolute disbelief. Samuel Higgins hadn't exaggerated when he called it dilapidated. Calling it a house was a gross overstatement. It was a shack, a terrifying asymmetrical monstrosity of rotting cedar wood and rusted corrugated metal. Half of the front porch had collapsed in on itself. Weeds as tall as Alice choked the perimeter, and the windows were grimy, covered in thick layers of undisturbed dust and spiderwebs. It looked like the setting of a horror movie, a place utterly forgotten by time and civilization. Lily gripped Alice's hand tightly as they stepped out of the car. "Mommy, it looks scary. It's just old, baby," Alice lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It just needs a little love. And some soap. A lot of soap." Before they could even approach the rotting wooden steps, the roar of a high-end engine broke the silence of the woods. A sleek silver Mercedes SUV barreled up the dirt driveway, splashing mud onto Alice's jeans. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Aunt Beatrice, wrapped in a ridiculous oversized fur coat. Beatrice looked around the property with a deep sneer of disgust before locking her predatory eyes on Alice. "Well, well, well." Beatrice laughed, her voice dripping with venom. "Your father told me you got kicked to the curb. I came up here to collect Arthur's Mustang from the barn, but I just had to see the estate you inherited." Beatrice walked toward the shack, careful not to let her designer boots touch the mud, and let out a shrill, mocking cackle. "Oh, Alice, this is poetic justice. Richard always said you were destined for the gutter, and look where you've ended up. A garbage dump for a daughter." "Leave us alone, Beatrice," Alice said, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. "Just take your car and go." Beatrice smirked, pulling a set of keys from her pocket. "Gladly. Have fun freezing to death in a hoarder's rat nest." Alice covered Lily's ears as Beatrice revved the engine of the classic Mustang she found in the dilapidated barn out back, peeling out of the driveway and leaving them in total silence. Swallowing her pride and her rising panic, Alice took the brass key and approached the front door. The lock was stiff, protesting with a loud screech before finally giving way. Pushing the heavy oak door open, Alice was hit with a wall of stagnant, musty air. The inside was worse than the outside. Great Uncle Arthur had been a profound hoarder. Floor-to-ceiling stacks of yellowed newspapers, dating back to the 1980s, created claustrophobic mazes throughout the living room. Broken radios, rusted tools, jars of unrecognizable bolts, and bizarre paranoid scribblings tacked to the walls made the space feel insane. There was no electricity. The water from the kitchen pump came out brown. Alice felt a sob rising in her throat, a heavy, crushing wave of despair. Had she driven 5 hours just to subject her daughter to this? But she looked at Lily, who was shivering in the damp cold of the shack. Alice had no other options. She had $14. She couldn't afford gas to get back to Connecticut, and she certainly couldn't afford a hotel. This shack, this rotting wooden nightmare, was their only shield against the incoming winter night. "Okay, Lilybug," Alice forced a bright fake smile. "We're going to make a fort, an indoor camping adventure." For the next 4 hours, Alice worked like a woman possessed. She cleared a 5 by 5 feet space in the center of the living room, hauling stacks of heavy damp newspapers out onto the ruined porch. She found a rusty but functional wood-burning stove in the corner. Using some of the dry newspapers and broken chair legs she smashed against the floor, she managed to get a small crackling fire going. The warmth slowly pushed back the freezing dampness of the room. Alice set up their sleeping bags near the stove, feeding Lily a dinner of peanut butter sandwiches from their cooler. Exhausted by the day's trauma, Lily fell asleep, quickly wrapped securely in her sleeping bag. Alice, however, couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, violently rattling the old window panes. The shack creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Around 2:00 a.m., the storm worsened. A massive gust of wind struck the side of the house, and Alice heard a distinct loud crack from the small attached mudroom near the back of the shack. Terrified that the roof was caving in, Alice grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and her phone, using the weak beam of the flashlight to navigate the narrow, cluttered hallway. She pushed open the door to the mudroom. The roof was intact, but a heavy wooden shelf holding ancient paint cans had collapsed, scattering debris everywhere. Sighing in relief, Alice stepped forward to clear the mess. As her boot came down on the floorboards, it didn't make the usual solid thud. It made a hollow, resonant thunk. Alice froze. She tapped her foot again. Thunk, thunk. Frowning, she aimed her phone's flashlight at the floor. Beneath the spilled nails, dirt, and rotting wood, she noticed that the floorboards were not laid in a continuous pattern. There was a perfect 3F by 3F square cut into the wood. Curiosity overcoming her exhaustion, Alice knelt down. She used the sharp end of the fire poker to pry up a rusted piece of linoleum that was partially covering the square. Her breath hitched. Bolted flush into the rotting wood was a massive, heavy iron ring. It wasn't just a loose floorboard. It was a trap door. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. Arthur was fiercely paranoid. What on earth did a man who trusted no one, hated banks, and hoarded trash keep locked away under the floor of his ruined shack? Gripping the freezing iron ring with both hands, Alice braced her boots against the floor and pulled with all her might. The stairs went impossibly deep. 10 steps, 20, 30. Alice felt the ambient temperature completely shift. The biting winter freeze was replaced by a dry, regulated coolness. When her boots finally hit a solid concrete floor, she swept her flashlight around, her breath catching in her throat. This was no root cellar. It was a massive subterranean bunker, roughly the size of a gymnasium, constructed entirely from thick reinforced concrete. The walls were lined with heavy-duty metal shelving, holding thousands of MREs, water filtration systems, and survival gear. In the corner sat a massive industrial diesel generator, wired into a complex grid of deep-cycle marine batteries. Arthur Pendleton hadn't just been a hoarder. He had been a high-level doomsday prepper. Alice walked cautiously down the center aisle, her light cutting through the absolute darkness. At the very back of the bunker, sitting on a raised concrete dais, were 6 massive olive-green military footlockers. They were locked with heavy master padlocks, but the steel hasps on the wood were rusted from decades of sitting in the deep earth. Driven by a manic surge of curiosity, Alice wedged the sharp tip of her iron fire poker under the hasp of the first locker. She threw all her body weight into the lever. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the bunker, the rusted metal snapped. Alice dropped the poker. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift the heavy lid. When she finally threw it back, she didn't find guns, and she didn't find more canned food. She found dull, heavy, yellow bricks. Alice froze. Her mind refused to process the visual information. She reached out her fingertips, brushing against the freezing surface of the top brick. She grabbed it, stunned by the immense concentrated weight of the object. It took both hands to comfortably lift a single brick into the beam of her flashlight. Stamped into the gleaming metal was an insignia Valcombe Suisse, 1,000 km fine gold, 999.9. No, Alice whispered, her voice echoing in the dead silence. No way. This isn't real. She dropped the brick back into the locker. It landed with a heavy, muted thud that only solid gold could make. Frantically, she tore open the other 5 lockers using the poker. Gold. All of them. Hundreds upon hundreds of 1 kilo bars. Mixed among them were thousands of 1 Oz Canadian maple leaf and South African Krugerrand coins, meticulously stacked in plastic tubes. Sitting atop the final locker was a thick, leather-bound journal. Alice opened it. The handwriting was sharp, erratic, and deeply paranoid. It was Arthur's ledger. October 19th, 1987. Black Monday. The first entry read, "The markets are a rigged casino. Richard and the rest of those Wall Street vultures think they are gods. They are fools building castles on sand. Today, I liquidated my entire portfolio, $42 million. I am converting every cent into physical assets. The banks will not trap me. The government will not bleed me. I will bury my empire where those greedy, status-obsessed Jefferson sycophants will never find it." Alice flipped through decades of entries. Arthur had been an anonymous, savant-level commodities trader. He lived in absolute squalor to avoid taxes, audits, and the attention of his own family, while quietly amassing a staggering fortune in precious metals. The final entry, dated just 2 months ago, made Alice's eyes fill with tears. "My heart is failing. The doctors give me weeks. I have watched my niece, Alice, from a distance for years. She is the only Jefferson with a soul. She works. She loves her child. When Richard threw her to the wolves, he proved exactly what this family is. The wealth is hers. May it be the sword she uses to sever the heads of those vipers." Alice sat heavily on the concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune so massive it broke her comprehension. She didn't have $14. She was sitting in a room holding over $85 million in untraceable physical gold. She wasn't helpless anymore. She was dangerous. Alice didn't sleep a single second that night. When the sun finally broke through the gray morning clouds, she drove 2 miles down the mountain until her phone caught a single bar of cellular service. She dialed Samuel Higgins. "Samuel." Alice said, her voice completely devoid of its former desperation, replaced by a cold, sharp steel. I need you to contact Brinks Global Services immediately. I need 3 armored transport trucks, heavily armed guards, and a secure vault at Vanguard. We have a situation at the property. The lawyer was stunned into silence, but within 4 hours, the quiet woods of Oak Haven were completely locked down by private security contractors. Alice watched stoically as armed men hauled locker after locker out of the ruined mudroom, weighing and cataloging the bars under Samuel's watchful, disbelieving eyes. But wealth of that magnitude cannot remain a secret for long. A clerk at the local probate office caught wind of the astronomical asset transfer happening in Oak Haven. Within 48 hours, a gossip blog in Greenwich published a blind item about a disgraced heiress striking a multi-million-dollar gold vein in a hoarder's cabin. Richard Jefferson didn't need a map to know exactly who the article was about. A week later, Alice, now living in a sprawling high-security penthouse in Manhattan, was served with a massive lawsuit. Richard and Barbara had hired a notoriously vicious litigation firm, claiming Arthur Pendleton was severely mentally incompetent. They demanded the estate be immediately seized and redistributed to the rightful next of kin, meaning Richard. They wanted to crush her. They wanted the gold, and they wanted her back in the gutter. The court date was set for early March in the Southern District of New York. Alice walked into the mahogany courtroom wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, looking like a completely different human being. She held her chin high. Lily was safe, enrolled in one of the most elite private schools in the city with a trust fund that would protect her for 10 lifetimes. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, radiating arrogance. Aunt Beatrice sat directly behind him, glaring daggers at Alice. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney began pacing the floor. Arthur Pendleton was a documented hermit who lived in his own filth. He was utterly detached from reality. We have psychiatric evaluations suggesting extreme paranoia. The idea that he possessed the mental capacity to execute a valid will, let alone disinherit his own brother in favor of an estranged 26-year-old, is legally absurd. The estate belongs to my client. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for theatrics, looked over her glasses at Samuel Higgins. "Counselor, what does the defense have to say?" Samuel stood up calmly. He didn't bring a stack of papers. He brought a small USB drive. "Your Honor, Arthur Pendleton was eccentric, yes, but he was also one of the most brilliant private commodities traders of the 20th century. He anticipated this exact frivolous lawsuit. We submit into Evidence Defense Exhibit A, Arthur's final testament." A large screen flickered to life in the courtroom. On the screen was Arthur Pendleton sitting in his underground bunker surrounded by the crates of gold. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes sharp and lucid. "My name is Arthur Pendleton." The recording echoed through the stunned courtroom. "I am of completely sound mind. I am recording this because my brother Richard is a greedy, narcissistic parasite. If you are watching this, it means Richard has tried to steal what belongs to Alice. Let me be unequivocally clear. I despise Richard. He is a fraud who over-leverages his client's money to fund a fake lifestyle. I leave every ounce of my wealth to Alice Jefferson because she is the only one who knows the value of a dollar and the value of a human life." Arthur leaned closer to the camera, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "And Richard, if you're watching this, check your Cayman Island hedge fund. The tech bubble is bursting again, and you're exposed. You're going to lose everything." The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Richard's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He frantically pulled out his phone, his hands violently trembling. The judge slammed her gavel down repeatedly. "Case dismissed with prejudice," the judge barked. "Mr. Jefferson, if you ever waste this court's time again, I will sanction you into oblivion." Alice didn't say a word to her father as she walked out of the courtroom. She didn't need to. The execution had already been carried out. Arthur's final prediction had been dead on. 2 years later, a massive correction in the commercial real estate market completely wiped out Richard's overly aggressive hedge fund. The SEC launched an investigation. His assets were frozen. His fake pristine empire crumbled to dust in a matter of months. On a brisk November morning, exactly 3 years to the day after she was thrown onto the street, Alice drove a sleek, bulletproof Range Rover up the familiar driveway of the Greenwich mansion. The lawn was unkempt. The fountain was dry. Standing on the porch were Richard and Barbara Jefferson. They looked 10 years older, hollowed out by stress and bankruptcy. A bank representative was standing next to a locksmith who was in the process of drilling out the front door's deadbolt. The estate had been lost to foreclosure. Alice stepped out of her car. She wore a heavy, luxurious wool coat. Lily, now 8 years old and beaming with confidence, held her mother's hand. Richard looked up, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and profound shame. "Alice," he rasped, his voice pathetic and weak. "What? What are you doing here? I heard the bank auctioned off the property," Alice said, smoothly walking up the front steps. She pulled a heavy brass key from her pocket, the new key to the mansion. "I bought it, through an anonymous LLC, of course." Vanguard handled the paperwork. Barbara let out a stifled sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. "You own it," Richard whispered, the horrific reality crashing down on him. "I do," Alice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "And the buyers want the house empty by today." Richard's legs gave out. He slumped against one of the massive white pillars of the porch. "Alice, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "We have nothing. The SEC took the accounts. We have nowhere to go." Alice stood exactly where her father had stood 3 years ago. She looked down at the man who had cast her and her child into the freezing cold without a second thought. She felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Lily crying in a freezing Walmart parking lot. Alice reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a checkbook, and quickly scribbled on a page. She tore the check out and let it flutter down onto the porch, landing directly at Richard's feet. "That is exactly the kind of problem a man your age should be able to solve," Alice said, her voice echoing with the ghosts of the past. "I'm giving you a head start. Use it wisely." Richard picked up the check with shaking hands. It was made out to him in the exact amount of 14. Alice turned her back on them, holding Lily's hand tightly as they walked inside their new home, leaving the Jefferson family outside in the biting winter cold. What would you do if you found a secret bunker filled with $85? Would you take the high road? Or would you exact the ultimate revenge on those who wronged you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If Alice's incredible story of survival and poetic justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more crazy, real-life stories.